September 23rd, 1883. 8 men crowd into a wooden rail car in upstate New York. They are brakemen on the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, and railroading is one of the deadliest jobs in America. Men like them are routinely hurt or permanently damaged doing it. That is not a guess. That is the era they live in. They have no union, no insurance, no leverage. What they have is a caboose number 10, parked in the Oneonta yards. And in that caboose, sitting on tool crates and speaking in low voices, they start something. The Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, one of the first national unions for railway workers in America, founded inside a caboose, out of sight and out of the way, because that's where the men actually worked. 105 years later, the railroads will erase every caboose from regular mainline freight service, and the device that replaces them will be nicknamed Fred. The crews have another name for it. They call it the rear end detector. Someone did the math and decided that human beings were the expensive part. The caboose was never just a red wagon at the back of the train. It was a mobile command post, a safety platform, and for the men who worked there, something close to a second home. Conductors ran their paperwork from a desk bolted to the floor. Brakemen watched the train ahead through the cupola, scanning for smoke from overheated bearings, for shifted loads, and for dragging equipment. Before automatic air brakes, these men walked the tops of moving freight cars in rain and snow to set hand brakes. The caboose was where they came back to warm up, eat, and sleep on longer runs. By the 1920s, tens of thousands of cabooses operated on American rails. Each railroad painted them in company colors, bright reds mostly, sometimes greens and blues. Kids waved at them from crossings. Photographers waited to catch that splash of color disappearing down the track. But inside, the work was brutal. Slack action from long trains could throw a man across the car without warning. Rear-end collisions in wooden cabooses were often unsurvivable. The Brotherhood formed in a caboose because that is where the men who needed protection actually worked. Two things changed the math on cabooses, and neither one happened overnight. First came the hot box detectors. Starting in the 1940s, railroads began installing infrared sensors along the tracks that could scan every axle bearing as a train passed. By the mid-1950s, these detectors were widespread, installed at regular intervals along main lines. They could catch an overheating bearing before it burned off, which used to be one of the main jobs of the caboose crew. The sensors did their job around the clock, in fog, in darkness, in conditions where human eyes would miss the warning signs. And that gave management exactly the excuse they needed. Second came the end-of-train device. Florida East Coast Railway tested the first one in 1968 or 1969, depending on which source you trust. It was a metal box, maybe 30 pounds, bolted to the rear coupler. Inside sat a brake pressure sensor, a motion detector, and a flashing red light. The box transmitted data by radio to a receiver in the locomotive cab. The engineer could see at a glance whether the brakes were charged at the rear of the train, whether the last car was still attached, whether something had gone wrong. Later versions added two-way communication, GPS tracking, and emergency brake capability. The device in the locomotive cab got its own nickname. Some crews even named the head-end unit Wilma. Fred and Wilma, married at the rear of every train. Here is where someone made a choice. A new caboose in the 1980s often cost around $80,000. It weighed 25 tons, required maintenance, needed to be switched through terminals, and carried crew members who drew wages, needed rest periods, and occasionally got injured on the job. A new Fred cost a few $1,000s. It weighed under 30 pounds. It did not eat, sleep, complain, or file grievances. The Association of American Railroads called the cost of operating cabooses a financial bleed. The industry wanted stopped. That is their framing, not mine. They looked at the men in those cabooses and saw a line item that needed cutting. The unions fought it. Of course they fought it. The United Transportation Union pointed out that sensors cannot smell smoke, cannot see down the length of a train, and cannot make judgment calls in situations the engineers never anticipated. Houston Kitts, the UTU legislative director, put it plainly in 1988. Even if these machines were perfect, they do not have eyes. They do not have a sense of smell. They cannot climb down and check something that looks wrong. But the railroads had leverage the unions could not match. In 1982, President Reagan convened Presidential Emergency Board 195 under the Railway Labor Act. A nationwide railroad strike was threatening. The unions were dug in, and the board pushed the industry toward eliminating caboose crews where it could. The knock-on effect was obvious: fewer people per train. That was not a suggestion. That was the federal government picking a side. State laws were the last barrier. Virginia had required cabooses on freight trains since 1911. Montana had similar rules. One by one through the 1980s, those laws fell. Virginia held out until July 1, 1988. When that statute was repealed, the legal protection for cabooses in America effectively ended. What followed was fast, and it was deliberate. Railroads did not phase out cabooses gradually. They gutted the fleet. Thousands of cars went to scrap. Some were donated to towns and museums as if they were doing the public a favor. A few ended up as hunting cabins, gift shops, backyard novelties. CSX kept a small fleet for switching operations, doors welded shut, crews working from the rear platform. But on mainline freight, the caboose was erased. The men who had worked in them scattered into other jobs or out of the industry entirely. Crew sizes fell from 5 to 2. The conductor moved up to the locomotive cab with the engineer. The brakemen, the flagmen, the rear-end crews who had watched over American freight trains for more than a century, they were written off. Fred did not replace a rail car. Fred replaced rear-end crews, and management called that progress. The Federal Railroad Administration never considered caboose elimination a safety issue. That is on record. Overall train accident rates fell sharply in the decades that followed. Injuries to rear-end crew members fell to nearly zero, mostly because there were no longer any rear-end crew members to injure. The accountants were happy. The shareholders were happy. The men who used to work those jobs found other work or left the industry. Safety was not the deciding factor, at least on paper. But here is the thing about removing humans from a system. In February 2023, a Norfolk Southern train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. Early reporting and investigations focused heavily on an overheated wheel bearing. The train was 150 cars long, nearly 2 miles of freight. There was no caboose, no crew watching the train itself, no human eyes between the locomotive and that final coupler. The hotbox detectors flagged the problem, and the train still went off the rails. Human judgment had been taken out of the equation. Caboose number 10 still sits in Oneonta, New York, under a protective shelter in Neawa Park. The Leatherstocking Railway Historical Society maintains it and opens it for visitors on special occasions. In 1983, they held a ceremony for the 100th anniversary of the Brotherhood's founding, right there beside that same wooden car where 8 brakemen had decided they deserved better. Brotherhood is preserved in that small building. The union that was born inside those walls merged out of existence in 1969, folded into the United Transportation Union along with 3 other brotherhoods. The railroads are still here, still running, still profitable. And at the end of every freight train in America, a small metal box blinks red in the darkness, doing the job that used to belong to men who had names, who had families, who waved back at kids standing by the crossings. Those names are easy to forget, but the consequences of removing them remain.